In the last two videos, we covered the basics of Anamorfake and market-ready solutions. Now let's dive into streak flares, where they come from, how to create your own, and what kind of control you have over their look in this process. In the next few videos, we're going to mod more than a dozen lenses and discuss post-production techniques to enhance your faking of the anamorphic look. Stay tuned. Talking about fishing line streak filters was one of my earliest videos on the channel. Despite a lot of judgy attitude towards the line through bokeh that these filters create, ARRI offers streak filters for their master anamorphics, and many big productions have used such solutions, like the John Wick franchise, where they wanted a clean anamorphic look, but also streak flares. Streak flares are the most adored trait of the anamorphic look. More than oval bokeh, I dare to say. So in the anamorphiking process, we must have options for achieving said flares. First, let's talk about how the streaks are created. Then, we'll go into where we can put our flare filters. The latter part of this episode is about several DIY methods and filters that you can buy right now, expanding what we saw on episode 1. But let's take a stab at where they come from. Lens flares in general are an artifact created when strong rays of light bounce around inside of a lens, hitting the various glass elements, aperture blades, and insides of the body. Why do only anamorphics have streak flares then? The cylindrical glass elements responsible for the squeeze are the ones generating the elongated internal reflections, and the coatings on the glass cast the colors shown on the streaks. If you already tried simulating the anamorphic look before, you probably know the fishing line over the front of the lens trick that can create streak flares on any lens. To understand how this happens, I went to Brian Caldwell, creator of the Speed Booster, and recently the Chameleon anamorphic lenses. The streak flare from fishing line is similar to star patterns from an iris opening, caused by diffraction from either side of the wire. Similarly, a three-sided aperture will have 6 flare star points emanating in either direction perpendicular to each of these flat faces. A perpendicular knife edge should also create horizontal flare. That kind of helped. It was only after looking at examples of lens flares and noticing that the number of points in the star is always twice the number of straight edges in the aperture shape that this idea really clicked for me. Plus, I was able to get a streak flare from a knife in front of the lens, so it all checks out. This is the literal razor-sharp lens. On real anamorphic flares, you can get some depth and separation between the streak elements, which anamorphics can't deliver. But they are the next best thing, and most of them are super cheap, so it's a worthy consideration. We can put streak flares in 3 different places: in front of the lens, like a regular filter, inside the lens, with an oval or iris insert, or behind the glass, in an adapter between the lens and the camera. All of these practical solutions hurt bokeh though. Some will be more noticeable, others less. We are introducing obstacles to the light coming through the lens, and these obstacles show up in the out of focus areas. The only way to achieve streak flares and clean bokeh is through post-production. So if bokeh is untouchable for you, hold on for episode 5 when we'll talk about post-production. Still, if you think about it, not every shot features super noticeable out of focus highlights. Just like not every shot will have a streak flare in it. So it's a case of picking the proper moments to mount the filter on the lens to accommodate clean bokeh when that matters most, and streak flares when they are more important. The colors of anamorphic flares are directly related to the color of the diffractive surface, aka the fishing line. If your streak filter is blue, you will get blue flares. If the lines are clear, the flares will take on the color of the light source creating the flare. Multiple light sources with different colors will create a shot that shows flares with all of those different colors. For tinting DIY filters, Sharpie markers offer great results and are cheap enough to buy an arsenal of different colors. In order of cost, we'll first look at a basic scratch across a UV filter, followed by a line across the front of the lens, an old Cokin filter, Vid-Atlantic streak flare, CinePacks flare filter, NiSi's Allure streak filters, then Schneider's streak flares. Past that point, if you really want to spend money, you should look into Tiffen, Schneider, or even Lindsay Optics' options. I shot the comparisons for all the flare options back to back, which makes it easy to notice the differences between them. I have multiple light sources and colors, different depths to compare how the filter affects bokeh, and various focal lengths to consider if longer or wider lenses break the effect. Unbeatable simplicity. Get a cheap UV filter, a ruler, and an X-Acto knife, and run a straight cut down the center of the filter. The straighter the cut, the cleaner the flare. It is hard for me to say something is straight up bad. This is one of those cases, and here's my take on it. Simple, cheap, yet not worth it. Still, here's the info. While making mine, I had to run the X-Acto knife multiple times over the same line in order to get a decent strike on the glass. It gets easier with every pass. Also, a UV filter is not the best mounting frame because it does not allow you to freely rotate the scratch for perfect alignment. I recommend screwing this onto an empty polarizer frame so you can make sure the flare is perfectly horizontal every time. I noticed loss of contrast, hardly visible streaks, and a giant line through bokeh. I did not tint the scratch, so the flares take on the color of the light sources that create them. On my first try, I just taped the line on both sides of the barrel. This gave me skewed results, so I made a 3D printed part that keeps the line straight. It can be inserted into a 77mm filter frame and rotated for alignment. It was a bit too complicated and I should have just improved my tape job. I learned from it, so you can save time. If you're a member of the channel, you can also get the 3D print file on Discord and decide if I overcomplicated it or not. Different thicknesses of fishing line give different flares. My personal take is the thinner, the better. And these samples used a 0.2mm line. I had a clearer string across the front of the lens, which made stronger neutral flares. No tint means flares matching light sources. It also has a high threshold as to which light creates flares. This will give you a line down bokeh, unavoidable. What makes this option pricier than wrecking a UV filter is that you have to buy a whole reel of fishing line for using just a tiny piece. I also noticed that all the streak filters using fishing line had splintery flares. They are thin around the light source, but as the flare stretches out, the ends widen and we get many multi-directional splinters. I find Vid-Atlantic streak filters produce better results than the basic fishing line when they actually flare. They come in two sizes, 58 and 77mm, on a rotating frame that allows you to quickly realign your flares. I also find it useful to lock rotation with a small piece of tape, preventing accidentally skewed flares. Their website shows beautiful shots and nice streaks. But the ones that I got on this test were quite muted. Maybe these need a very strong light source, and I failed at that. On the bright side, damage to bokeh is almost imperceptible. If you're using natural light and getting flares straight from the sun or other stupidly strong light source, you should have better results than I did. Now we step into a different category of streak filters. All options so far featured a single line right down the middle of the lens. The advantages of having multiple lines are that you get stronger flares overall, and flares show up more easily. The spacing between the lines determines the strength of the flares. For example, 2mm spaced lines give off much stronger flares than 4mm spaced lines. The downside is that now we have multiple lines cutting through bokeh. I learned as I tested that 50mm is the ideal focal length for these, and you can go longer without problems. The flares themselves thicken as you switch for longer lenses, and they always look nice. Bokeh is affected the exact same way regardless of focal length. So longer lenses make bokeh artifacts more noticeable simply because bokeh is larger in the frame. As you go wider though, single line filters will start to fall apart and give you shorter and thicker flares, while multi-line filters hold up pretty well even on wide angles. Front streak filters will start to distort with the optics too, becoming bendy at the top and bottom of the frame. This is something that also happens with wide-angle anamorphics, so I find it to be a nice touch on the Anamorfakes. The rear-mounted filter we'll see soon always keeps the lines straight. When it comes to focus, these flares are focusable, which means that the streak will be sharpest and thinnest when the light source is in focus. That is, the phone's flashlight in all of these tests. As you rack away, the flare kind of expands vertically, which works super well for background and out-of-frame light sources. This one was the biggest surprise of the lot. I had to get creative to mount it on a regular 77mm thread, but I'm capable. Take this creative mounting into account if you pursue the Cokins. They follow very strange size charts, so check those first. Here we have the P series at about 77mm. They follow Cokin's naming and fall under star filters. This would be a 2-point star, which happens to be a line. The streaks are neutral and everything flares. Even the tiniest twinkly lights had streaks. Flares are not splintery as the regular fishing line and have a nice foul off as they get further away from their sources. Bokeh gets busier if you know what you're looking for, but if you're unaware, this is actually the most discreet result I got for streaks in out-of-focus highlights, especially when considering how many streaks it makes. CinePacks just recently joined the team of streak filter makers with a rotating frame and clear lines. These only come in 77mm, so get step rings for smaller lenses. The result is you get strong flares that take on the color of the light source. These guys are fancy and come in a nice pouch, which protects it. There's no need to add extra scratches to a streak filter, right? We saw how that plays out in the first example of this episode. Tiffen, NiSi, and Schneider streak filters can be found in different sizes and different mounting systems. If you use a compact rig, you can get them on rotating 77 or 82mm threads. But if you have a matte box with filter trays, there's also the option to go with 4x4s or 4x5.65 sizes at a more expensive price. The one that I use for this test is a Schneider 77mm streak orange 2mm. The color of the lines controls the color of the flares, and these are undoubtedly orange regardless of the light source's color. I think they're a bit too intense, but the audience will definitely notice these flares. The 2mm number indicates the spacing between the flare lines. Smaller spacing induces stronger flares, but it also means more lines crossing through your bokeh. NiSi also offers streak flares with similar prices and performance. They favor blue as the default, but you can reach out and get custom colors like yellow, green, red, which is pretty neat if you want a specific color. had the idea for this contraption after seeing an Arri Alexa modification by Claremont Camera that put a bunch of streak lines inside the camera mount, behind the lens. So I bought a cheap EF to mirrorless adapter without electronics, measured its insides, and made a 3D model to hold 5 lines across the sensor. I assumed the size would fit most adapters from EF to different sensor sizes. And again, if you're a Super 35 member of the channel, you can get the blueprint for this in the Discord server. As much as I wanted to love this option, it has very pronounced quirks. It is super convenient to have the flares created inside your lens adapter. Getting all of the strings in place can take a few minutes, but once the setup is complete, you are done with it. You only have to align the flares once, regardless of which lens you are using. As all previous string-based filters, the flares are quite splintery. There was no tint, so the flares keep the light's colors, and again, we see a fairly high threshold for which lights flare up. Bokeh is cut up unevenly depending on its position in the frame, which gives a distracting look. Strangest of all is performance when not shooting wide open. I had flares disappear and reappear through panning shots when the lens was stopped down to f4 or 5.6. It has something to do with the path of the light and the space between the strings. Having them in front of the lens, light always hits the filter. But behind the whole optical system, loopholes exist. These streak filters are usually combined with an oval insert, since the line sits inside the lens right by the aperture mechanism. The only cost is the price of the fishing line, but each lens has a different process of disassembling, so it could be a challenging build as it changes case by case. I used a 0.2mm string tinted blue inside of a Gallius 44-2, and I feel the tint was very bland while affecting the flares' colors. The splintery look was also noticeable here. Even if the string is perfectly aligned, you get lines shooting in different directions. Bokeh gets a cut right down the middle, and it's quite noticeable. Though, observe that the cut's positioning does not change across the frame like the rear adapter did. It's always right down the middle. This sums up all the practical ways I could come up to create streak flares. Some are wildly original, others are tried and true DIY methods, and some of them are also used in high-budget productions.
What's wrong with that?
None of these are the ultimate solution without drawbacks, so it is up to you to decide which one works best for your budget and your shots. And if none of them are up to your standards, hang tight for episode 5, where we'll look at post-production options to create flares. In the next video, we're getting our workstations ready to start opening lenses and really get hands-on with crafting the anamorphic look. You better stick around, because I'll see you there. Tiffen out.